Hi guys. So I've seen a lot of discourse in the JJK community on Reddit and a bit of it on YouTube about why sorcerers don't make death binding vows when they're about to die. Now, first we need to understand what binding vows actually are. Binding vows can be one of two things. You can either make a binding vow with another person, where you make a exchange of certain things. This is shown with Kenjaku and how he made binding vows with sorcerers from the ancient era to revive them in the modern era, okay? In exchange for them becoming cursed objects and participating in the culling games. That is a binding vow between two different people. I honestly do think that binding vows between two different people should be more flexible, okay? Because it doesn't necessarily have to be fair, it just has to be an exchange of certain conditions. Binding vows with yourself, however, are a bit more complicated. Because we have seen Sukuna perform very, like, seemingly not really fair binding vows. So I think we can make the assumption, and I think this is a bit of a popular assumption with some of the JJK community, that a binding vow with yourself is dependent on what you perceive as fair. Okay? So if you're an absolute idiot and you think that sacrificing 1% of your output in normal swings in exchange for 99% more output in terms of your charged up attacks, yeah, that's fair. If you think it's fair, fine. But there's not a single person in Jujutsu that is actually that stupid to actually think that's fair. Okay? This also explains why Sukuna is able to make these binding vows that shouldn't really make as much sense as they do. I'm not saying that the binding vows don't make sense from Sukuna. I do think they make sense to a degree, but I think it's more about what he perceives fair that really locks it into being something that makes sense. And I think this is also fair in terms of any other sorcerer, in terms of binding vows. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, all right, let's talk about death binding vows. Now, death binding vows, okay, they're a bit more complicated. Now, let's explain why exactly Megumi summoning Maharaga is not a death binding vow, okay? Binding vows are not simple to make. You have to commit to it. With Megumi, right, when he used Maharaga against Haruta, he had the expectation that he was going to die, which means that his death was inevitable. It was inevitable at that moment. The only reason he survived is because Sukuna came up and used RCT output on him to save him. Something that Megumi didn't even know that Sukuna had. So Megumi was completely expecting to die after he summoned Maharaga. That is not a death binding vow, that is an expectation of death. And when you expect death, subconsciously the value of your own life decreases. Okay? This is how I perceive it, okay? Your binding vow depends on your own perception of fairness. So, if you're facing an opponent that is massively stronger than you and you know you're gonna die, then a death binding vow will either not work or it will be absolutely worthless because the exchange of you dying is already expected. So, whatever governs binding vows, which is probably yourself, will say, I'm already gonna die, so is giving up my life for this really that fair of an exchange? No, it's kind of not, right? So that is the problem with death binding vows. Okay? Now let's move on to circumstances where death binding vows actually work. Like they genuinely work, okay? Think about the time when Yuka summoned Maharaga against Dabura. Now this is not the same as Megami summoning Maharaga, okay? She went into the shadows, which should have kept her safe under normal conditions. She should have survived that to until at least Maharaga dealt with Dabura, okay? She should have survived. However, even when she was in the shadows, she died. It was a death binding vow. So she went in the shadows, she should have been able to survive, but she made a death binding vow to sacrifice her own life to boost Maharaga. Okay? That's how that works. So in that circumstance, her life has value. Sure, it doesn't have, you could argue that it doesn't have as much value as other people like Megumi's, because Megumi could realistically live until his 70s or something when he made that, if he made a binding vow. But Yuka only had a few months. But still, it had value. Her life had value. Her death was not inevitable, okay? Not to the same extent that you would expect from something like Megami using it. Sure, her death is to an extent inevitable because once Maharaga kills Dabura, she's next. But she still has veritable time before that death that she can exchange, okay? I guess it's a bit complicated in this regard, and you could argue that Yuka's death binding vow doesn't really make sense. I am starting to see as I talk that it doesn't really make all that much sense, but there is always the chance that Dabra would have won against Maharaga, that she could have conceived. So again, I'll point towards the fairness that you perceive, okay? And I'll use that as a metric for why Yuka's death and binding vow works and Megumi's doesn't. And honestly, there is no indication that Maharaga really would have been able to get into the Shadow Realm to like kill Yuka. So you could make arguments that Yuka otherwise would have fully like expected to survive that. So it's a bit hard to determine, but I think this is more of the consensus on how this shit works. Okay, so another thing to consider is that sorcerers do not go into battles expecting, like, they don't go into battles wanting to die. They expect that they could die, but they don't go into it with the intent of dying at all. So, considering these facts, basically, for example, right, if a sorcerer knew they were going to die, then their death binding vow is not as substantial as if they didn't know they were going to die. Okay? Honestly, I don't think death binding vows are as overpowered as people think they are because of the fact that you're giving up your life with the expectation that you're going to die if you don't, which is not really worth that much in terms of your subconscious. If you subconsciously think, I'm gonna die anyway, so I might as well make a binding vow to increase my output when I'm gonna die, it's just not as impactful as if you were like, I might die, but I'll make a binding vow to make it sure so that I can kill my opponent. I think death binding vows, when you're unsure about the fate of yourself, will be far more powerful and more substantial than death binding vows made when you think you're going to die. Just because of the value that that person will have of their own life at that moment. I'm sorry that I yapped. I just wanted to get the point across properly. Like and subscribe. I'll see you guys later.